Victoria Sterling stood in the absolute center of the private terminal lounge at Blackburn Airfield, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the elite travelers like a silver blade. The ambient lighting of the luxury terminal caught the sharp, impeccable lines of her tailored charcoal suit, reflecting off the diamond watch on her left wrist. She was 32 years old, the undisputed chief executive officer of Vanguard Aerospace, and a woman who had never learned the language of waiting. Garrett Vance stood 3 feet away from her, completely unbothered by the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. He wore heavy, oil-stained navy coveralls with the company logo fading across the breast pocket. His hands, calloused and mapped with faint scars from years of manual labor, were held loosely at his sides. He possessed a quiet, dense masculinity that made him seem entirely immovable, like a piece of structural steel anchored deep into the foundation of the building. Beside him, holding his massive thumb with her entire small hand, was 5-year-old Lily. She was a delicate child, wearing a faded denim jacket that was a size too small, her wide green eyes darting between her father and the elegant, furious woman towering over them. In her other hand, Lily clutched a small plastic toy airplane with a broken tail wing. Victoria slapped a digital tablet against Garrett's chest, her emerald-sharp eyes narrowing to slits. "You have exactly 60 seconds to input your clearance code and sign the airworthiness release for my aircraft," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Or I will personally see to it that the Port Authority drags you off this tarmac in handcuffs for corporate sabotage." The high-profile crowd in the terminal lounge, consisting of venture capitalists, local politicians, and international logistics magnates, turned their heads to watch the spectacle. Whispers rippled through the plush leather seating areas. Garrett did not flinch. His expression remained perfectly flat, a mask of absolute, unyielding calm. He looked down at the digital screen, then raised his eyes to meet Victoria's gaze directly. He didn't look at her outfit, her jewelry, or the security detail hovering behind her. He simply looked into her eyes. "The primary pitot-static heater on the left wing of the Sovereign X has an internal resistance drop," Garrett said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried an effortless authority through the quiet lounge. "In 20 minutes, when you reach the freezing layer over Lake Michigan at 30,000 feet, that sensor will ice over. Your autopilot will miscalculate the angle of attack, the computer will freeze, and the nose will pitch down into an unrecoverable dive." "I am not signing the flight release." Victoria let out a short, mocking laugh, a sound completely devoid of warmth. She stepped closer, the scent of her expensive French perfume mixing sharply with the aviation fuel and grease that clung to Garrett's uniform. "You are a line mechanic, Mr. Vance. You wipe windshields, check tire pressure, and top off engine oil." Captain Harrison Fletcher, a man with 24,000 hours of command experience in the air, has already conducted his pre-flight walk-around and declared the aircraft perfectly safe. "Who do you think my board of directors is going to believe? A man who makes a mechanic's wage? Or the elite engineers who designed the airframe?" Garrett shifted his gaze to Captain Fletcher, who stood near the terminal doors holding a flight bag. The seasoned pilot refused to look Garrett in the eye, instead staring intently at his navigation tablet. Fletcher knew the corporate pressure to make the New York merger summit was immense, and he was choosing to look away from the numbers. "Look at your daughter, Mr. Vance," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with cold disdain as she gestured toward Lily. "The girl is wearing shoes with holes in the soles. If you want to keep a roof over her head and food in her mouth, you will pick up that stylus, sign your name to the electronic log, and get out of my sight." A few corporate executives in the background chuckled softly, murmuring about how lower-class workers always tried to inflate their own importance by causing unnecessary delays for people who actually ran the world. Garrett shifted his body slightly, stepping forward just enough to place himself as a physical shield between Victoria's sharp, aggressive gestures and his daughter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't display a single ounce of anger. His composure was absolute. "My daughter's shoes are none of your concern, Miss Sterling," Garrett said quietly. "The safety of every soul on that aircraft is... I am the lead technical inspector on this shift. The federal aviation guidelines state that the aircraft cannot legally taxi without my signature. The Sovereign X stays on the ground until the heater matrix is replaced." Victoria's jaw tightened, her face flushing with a mixture of rage and disbelief that a blue-collar worker was defying her public commands. "Then you are fired," she said, each word hitting like a mallet. "Effective this exact second. Pack your tools, surrender your security badge, and get off my property." Captain Fletcher, Find another technician to sign the maintenance override immediately. Captain Fletcher stepped forward, his voice hesitant. Miss Sterling, company bylaws and federal statutes dictate that a line maintenance override can only be issued by a Tier 1 Master Engineering Director if the primary inspector refuses clearance. We don't have one on site. I own the company that manufactured the hull, Fletcher, Victoria snapped, turning her wrath on the pilot. I am the supreme authority on this airfield. Call the station manager. Have this man escorted to the perimeter gates. Garrett looked at her for 3 long, silent seconds. There was no fear in his eyes, no pleading, no resentment. It was the look of a man who operated on facts, completely detached from the emotional turbulence of wealth and pride. He slowly reached down, picked up Lily's small canvas backpack from the floor, and then hoisted his daughter effortlessly onto his broad shoulder. Lily wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck, burying her face into his collarbone, her tiny voice trembling as she whispered against his ear. Daddy, is the lady mad at us? Did I do something wrong? Garrett stroked her back with a large, grease-stained hand, his voice softening instantly into a warm, deeply comforting tone. No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. The lady is just in a heavy hurry. Come on, let's go home. He turned his back on the wealthiest woman in the aerospace industry and began walking toward the heavy glass exit doors that led out to the rain-slicked parking lot. The crowd watched him leave, some with pity, most with cold indifference. Just as Garrett reached the threshold, the automatic sliding doors opened and an elderly man in a dark tailored cashmere overcoat stepped into the lounge. He was flanked by 2 personal bodyguards. It was Lawrence Sterling, the legendary founder of Vanguard Aerospace, a cold-blooded billionaire who had built an empire from nothing and spent 40 years ruthlessly destroying his competitors. Lawrence stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked directly onto Garrett Vance's face. The older billionaire's expression completely froze. The absolute authority that usually radiated from him vanished, replaced by a sudden, unvarnished look of sheer shock and pale terror. His jaw dropped slightly, his eyes widening as if he were looking at a ghost rising from a grave. Garrett paused for a fraction of a second, his gaze meeting Lawrence's with a cold, piercing intensity. No words passed between them, but the silence in the room suddenly grew heavy with the weight of an untold past. Garrett gave the old man a single tight nod, shifted Lily safely on his shoulder, and walked out into the pouring rain. Lawrence turned around slowly, his hands visibly trembling as he gripped the silver handle of his walking cane. He looked across the terminal lounge at his daughter, his voice shaking with an emotion Victoria had never heard from her father in her entire life. Victoria, Lawrence whispered, his voice cracking. What did you just do? Victoria frowned, adjusting the lapels of her jacket, entirely confused by her father's sudden weakness. I just fired an arrogant line mechanic who was trying to hold my flight hostage over a minor sensor glitch, father. He was delaying the entire New York merger. Why? Lawrence's face lost every ounce of its color, turning completely white under the harsh terminal lights. He gripped his cane so hard his knuckles turned purple. You didn't just fire a mechanic, Victoria, he breathed, his voice filled with a terrifying dread. You just threw out the only man alive who designed the entire flight control architecture of our fleet. You just fired the former commander of the elite experimental fighter division. You just threw away Garrett Vance. The silence that blanketed the private terminal lounge was no longer polite. It was suffocating. Victoria Sterling froze, her hand still hovering near the lapel of her tailored jacket, her mind scrambling to process the words her father had just uttered. The elite travelers in the room shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs completely dying out as they watched the undisputed patriarch of Vanguard Aerospace tremble with genuine dread. What do you mean he designed the flight architecture? Victoria asked, her voice losing its icy edge, replaced by a sharp, defensive tremor. Father, look at him. He's a line mechanic. He's been on the night shift for 6 months. He lives in a rundown suburb and drives a 20-year-old truck. You're confusing him with someone else. Lawrence Sterling stepped forward, his walking cane striking the polished floor with a dull, echoing thud. He didn't look at the high-profile investors or the local politicians who were hungrily absorbing every detail of the family drama. He locked his eyes onto his daughter, his expression a mixture of profound disappointment and rising panic. I am not confusing him, Victoria, Lawrence said, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper that traveled across the quiet room. 10 years ago, before you took over operations, this company faced a catastrophic stability flaw in our flagship long-range transport line. The wings were experiencing aerodynamic flutter at high Mach numbers. 3 independent engineering firms told us it was an unsolvable structural defect. They told me to scrap the entire billion-dollar project. He paused, his breathing shallow as he glanced toward the glass doors where Garrett Vance had just vanished into the dark, rainy night. Then a 26-year-old military captain named Garrett Vance walked into my office, Lawrence continued, his hands tightening on his cane. He was the chief experimental test pilot for the Pentagon's classified Ghost Wing program. In less than 48 hours, he rewrote the entire digital fly-by-wire control laws on a legal pad. He didn't just fix the flaw. He created the safest, most advanced aerodynamic stabilization code in modern aviation history. Every single aircraft we sell today runs on his brain. And you just threw him out like garbage. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Captain Harrison Fletcher, who was quietly backing away toward the flight operations desk. "Fletcher," she commanded, her voice regaining a forced sharpness. "Is this true? Did you know who he was?" Captain Fletcher swallowed hard, sweating under the collar of his crisp, white uniform. Everyone in the elite military aviation circles knows the name Commander Vance. "Miss Sterling," the pilot confessed softly, looking down at his boots. "When he showed up on the civilian line maintenance roster 6 months ago, we thought it was a clerical error. Or a ghost. But no one dared question it. When he speaks about an airframe, you don't argue with him. Which is why, with all due respect, Miss Sterling, I am officially stepping down from this flight. The Sovereign X stays on the ground." Meanwhile, 5 miles away from the glaring lights of Blackburn Airfield, the heavy downpour drummed a steady, rhythmic beat against the roof of a modest, 2-bedroom house on Cedar Street. The interior was small, smelling faintly of lavender soap and fresh pine. There were no luxury furnishings, no high-end art pieces, and no security details. But the room possessed a profound, enveloping warmth that money could never replicate. Garrett Vance carefully lifted Lily off his shoulder and set her gently onto the faded plaid sofa. He knelt in front of her, his massive frame instantly shrinking to match her level. With practiced, infinitely patient hands, he unzipped her damp denim jacket, peeling it away before wrapping her in a thick, oversized fleece blanket. "Are you cold, sweetheart?" Garrett asked, his deep voice carrying a soft, melodic comfort that instantly stabilized the little girl's trembling shoulders. Lily shook her head, clutching her broken plastic airplane tightly against her chest. "I'm okay, Daddy, but that lady at the big building, she said we wouldn't have a roof anymore. Are we going to lose our house?" Garrett smiled, a genuine, gentle expression that transformed his rugged, battle-hardened face into a sanctuary of absolute safety. He reached out, his large thumb tenderly wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "Look at me, Lily," Garrett whispered, his eyes locked onto hers with unbreakable certainty. "As long as I am breathing, you will always have a roof. You will always have a home. No one in that tall glass building has the power to change that. Do you trust me?" Lily nodded instantly, the heavy weight of her childhood anxiety completely melting away under her father's steady, unyielding presence. "I trust you, Daddy." "Go wash your hands," Garrett said, patting her shoulder softly. "I'll make the cheesy pasta you like, and then we'll fix that airplane wing together." As Lily scurried off toward the bathroom, the warmth on Garrett's face slowly receded, replaced by the cool, calculating stillness of a man who had survived things far worse than corporate arrogance. He walked over to the kitchen counter, pulled his weathered leather wallet from his coveralls, and extracted a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a beautiful woman with bright, laughing eyes standing in front of a military hangar. He stared at the photo for a long, silent moment, his jaw tightening as the memories of a decade-old betrayal threatened to breach the walls he had built around his heart. Back at the Vanguard Aerospace headquarters, the lights in the executive suite burned late into the night. Victoria Sterling sat behind her massive mahogany desk, the glowing screen of her primary terminal reflecting off her pale face. She had spent the last 3 hours bypassing corporate firewalls, digging into the deeply encrypted legacy archives of the company's human resources database. Her initial anger had given way to an intense, gnawing suspicion. She wanted to prove her father wrong. She wanted to prove that the man in the stained coveralls was an irreplaceable nobody. Instead, the screen before her flashed a bright crimson warning banner. "Critical security alert. Access restricted. Under Pentagon Tier 5 classification." Victoria's fingers trembled on the keyboard. She used her Supreme Executive Override code, forcing the system to compile the heavily redacted file. When the data finally populated, her breath hitched completely in her throat. There were no records of a line mechanic named Garrett Vance. Instead, the document was filled with high-level military commendations, classified engineering patents, and a single, haunting digital photograph of Garrett wearing a dark flight suit standing in front of an advanced experimental fighter jet at an unnamed base in the Nevada desert. But it was the final page of the file that stopped her heart. It was a formal corporate settlement from 10 years ago, signed by her own father, Lawrence Sterling. The document outlined the immediate, forced retirement of Commander Garrett Vance from all military and corporate advisory roles, citing a catastrophic operational incident that had cost the life of Garrett's wife during a high-altitude atmospheric test. Victoria leaned back in her leather chair, her mind spinning as the pieces of a dark, hidden puzzle began to fall into place. Her father hadn't just respected Garrett Vance. He was terrified of him. And Garrett hadn't taken a low-wage mechanic job because he lacked options. He had chosen obscurity to hide his daughter from the very empire the Sterling family had built. Suddenly, her private phone buzzed loudly on the desk, shattering the quiet of the office. It was a direct line from the emergency dispatch center at Blackburn Airfield. "Miss Sterling," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, frantic and panicked. "We have a severe situation. Your father," he bypassed the ground halt order. He ordered Captain Fletcher's co-pilot to taxi the Sovereign X out anyway. They just took off into the storm to make the New York meeting. But 3 minutes into the climb, the left wing sensor suffered a total electrical freeze. The automated flight computer has locked up. The aircraft isn't responding to manual inputs. They are in a high-speed dive over the lake, and we don't have the code override. Victoria stood up so fast, her chair crashed to the floor, her face turning entirely bloodless as the dispatcher's next words shattered her reality. "Miss Sterling, your father is on that plane, and he's screaming for Garrett Vance." Victoria Sterling slammed her open palms onto the sleek console of the Central Operations Room at Blackburn Airfield. The glass-walled command center, usually a pristine temple of quiet corporate efficiency, was now a chaotic war zone of flashing red alerts and piercing audio alarms. On the massive radar grid towering over the room, the digital silhouette of the Sovereign X was pulsing a violent crimson, its altitude numbers tumbling downward in an agonizing, unchecked freefall. 32,000 feet, 28,000 feet, 24,000 feet. "Get him on the line!" Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking violently, entirely stripped of the supreme composure she had worn like armor just hours before. Her hair was completely disheveled, stray locks clinging to her tear-streaked cheeks. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand, her expensive diamond watch catching the harsh, rotating red warning lights of the bunker. "I don't care if he was terminated. Patch into his personal phone, override his cellular block, do whatever you have to do." The lead operations director, David Kincaid, clattered away at his keyboard, his face slick with terrified sweat. "Miss Sterling, the automated flight computer has completely locked the cockpit out. Captain Fletcher and his co-pilot are pulling back on the mechanical yokes with everything they have, but the fly-by-wire system thinks the plane is stalling because of that frozen sensor. It's forcing the nose down into the lake. The standard corporate override codes aren't responding. I am ringing his personal number now," a technician yelled, his fingers trembling over a patch panel. "It's dialing. It's ringing." He picked up. "Miss Sterling, you're live." Victoria lunged across the desk, grabbing the heavy black communications microphone with both hands, her knuckles turning completely bloodless. "Garrett!" she sobbed openly, dropping every ounce of her pride, her voice echoing through the entire command center. "Garrett, please! My father is on that plane." "The computer locked them out just like you said it would. It's diving over the water. They're going to die, Garrett. Please, I'm begging you. Save my father." 5 miles away, inside the quiet, warm kitchen on Cedar Street, the atmosphere was the absolute polar opposite. The small room smelled of rich, simmering tomato sauce and garlic. Garrett Vance stood by the stove, holding the phone casually to his ear with his shoulder, while using his large hand to gently stir a pot of pasta. Lily sat at the nearby wooden table, completely absorbed in her world. Beside her plate was the plastic toy airplane. Garrett had already neatly repaired the broken tail wing with a precise bead of industrial adhesive and a tiny aluminum bracket he had fashioned from a scrap piece in his garage. It looked stronger now than it had when it was new. Garrett listened to Victoria's hysterical sobbing through the speaker. His face didn't tighten, his breathing didn't accelerate. He remained an island of absolute, immovable stillness in the storm of her panic. What is their current altitude, airspeed, and descent rate, Miss Sterling? Garrett asked, his low, resonant voice entirely steady, carrying a clinical, grounded authority that instantly sliced through the screaming alarms on the other end of the line. Victoria gasped, scrambling to read the tumbling data on the primary radar screen. They're passing 18,000 feet. Airspeed is 410 knots and increasing. The descent rate is 9,000 feet per minute. Garrett, the pilot says the stick shaker is vibrating so violently they can't even hold the controls. Garrett turned off the stove burner with a deliberate, slow twist of his wrist. He looked down at Lily, who had stopped playing with her toy and was looking up at him, her small brow furrowed with instinctive worry as she heard the distant, frantic screaming from the phone speaker. "Daddy?" Lily whispered, her voice soft and trembling. "Is that the angry lady again? Is she hurting?" Garrett walked over to the table, sinking to his knees beside his daughter's chair. He placed a large, warm hand over her small shoulder, his expression instantly softening into a gaze of pure, protective comfort. "The lady is just very scared right now, sweetheart," Garrett said softly, his voice a soothing balm that instantly chased the fear from the little girl's eyes. "Her daddy is in trouble, and she needs me to help him. I need you to sit right here and eat your dinner like a big girl while I talk to her on the computer. Can you do that for me?" Lily looked at her freshly repaired toy airplane, then looked back at her father's calm, unbreakable eyes. She nodded bravely. "I can do it, Daddy. You always fix things." Garrett kissed the top of her head, stood up, and walked over to his small workspace in the corner of the living room. He flipped open a battered, military-grade, rugged laptop that had sat untouched under a canvas shroud for nearly 5 years. Back in the command center, Victoria watched the radar screen with a suffocating dread. The altitude numbers were flashing through 12,000 feet. The crowd of executives and technicians in the room had fallen completely silent, some covering their mouths, others closing their eyes, preparing for the inevitable sonic boom of a billion-dollar aircraft vaporizing against the black surface of Lake Michigan. Suddenly, a loud, heavy electronic chime echoed through the operations room speakers. David Kincaid's terminal screen violently blinked from a restricted blue to a deep, authoritative, sovereign purple. A massive data stream began cascading down the main display, rewriting the airfield's central tracking software in real time. "Miss Sterling!" Kincaid shouted, his eyes widening in pure disbelief. "Someone just initiated a remote Tier 1 satellite data link directly into the Sovereign X's primary flight management computer. It's bypassing the Port Authority firewalls entirely. It's coming from a residential IP address." Garrett's voice boomed through the command center's main audio system, completely commanding the room without raising its volume. "Miss Sterling, patch my audio directly into Captain Fletcher's headset on the primary emergency frequency," Garrett commanded. "Do it within the next 5 seconds, or the structural G-forces on the airframe will tear the tail section off when we try to pull up." Victoria didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. "Patch him through!" she roared at the technicians. "Give him full tactical command of the frequency." A loud pop of static filled the room, followed immediately by the terrifying, deafening roar of wind shear and cockpit alarms streaming directly from the falling aircraft. Captain Fletcher's voice came through, gasping for air, completely panicked. "Vanguard Flight 1, we are losing consciousness," Fletcher screamed through the static. "The control columns are completely jammed. We can't hold it." "Harrison, shut up and listen to my voice," Garrett said. The sheer chilling authority in his tone was so massive that the entire command center held its breath. "This is Commander Garrett Vance. I am taking remote command of your avionics bus." "Commander?" Fletcher gasped, a sudden, desperate flicker of hope piercing through his terror. "Sir, the computer won't let us override the stall profile." "I know," Garrett replied smoothly, his fingers flying across his weathered keyboard with rhythmic, flawless precision. "The automated logic is trapped in an infinite calculation loop because of the frozen left-wing pitot. It's ignoring your physical inputs. I am pushing a hard kernel purge through the secondary satellite link now. In exactly 3 seconds, your entire glass cockpit is going to go completely black. You will lose your displays, your artificial horizon, and your digital navigation." Victoria gripped the edge of the console, her heart stopping. "Garrett, if the cockpit goes black, how will they fly?" "They will fly by feel, Miss Sterling," Garrett said coldly. "Like real pilots used to do before your company started replacing human judgment with cheap sensor matrices to save $1 on production costs." On the main radar display, the altitude readout dropped past 7,000 feet. 3, 2, 1, Garrett, countdown. Purge initiated. Across the lake, the lights inside the cockpit of Vanguard Flight 1 died instantly, plunging the two pilots into pitch-black darkness, save for the storm lightning illuminating the clouds outside. The automated fighting systems fell silent. The terrifying vibration of the yoke suddenly stopped. "Now, Harrison," Garrett commanded, his voice a steady, unyielding anchor in the dark. The mechanical reversion valves are open. Pull back on the yokes together, smoothly. Do not jerk the controls, or you will snap the main spar. Pull, now. Victoria stared at the crimson dot on the radar. 6,000 feet. 5,000 feet. 4,000 feet. The speed was still a lethal 400 knots. The data line froze. The silence in the command center was so thick, it felt like concrete. Then, the digital altitude counter stopped its downward spiral. It paused at 3,200 feet. Slowly, agonizingly, the number began to climb. 3,400, 3,800, 4,200. "We have pitch control." Captain Fletcher's voice erupted through the speakers, sobbing with raw, unadulterated relief. "We are climbing. The airframe is stable. We are out of the dive. Oh my God, Commander. We're alive. We're alive." The operations room exploded into deafening cheers and applause. Technicians hugged each other, weeping openly, while the corporate executives slumped back into their chairs, wiping the cold sweat from their brows. Victoria collapsed to her knees on the floor, her face buried in her hands as silent, overwhelming tears of gratitude poured through her fingers. Her father was safe. The Empire was saved. She crawled back to her feet, reaching for the microphone, her voice trembling with an emotional depth she had never felt in her entire life. "Garrett," she whispered, her chest heaving. "I don't know what to say. You saved him. You saved all of them. Thank you. Please, tell me what you want. Name your price. Anything." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The sound of the command center celebration seemed to fade into nothingness against the weight of Garrett's complete clinical silence. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't filled with triumph. It was filled with a cold, devastating truth that cut Victoria deeper than any insult ever could. "I didn't do it for your money, Miss Sterling," Garrett said quietly, the sound of Lily's soft laughter echoing faintly in the background of his home. "And I didn't do it for you. 10 years ago, your father made a choice that took a life from my family. Tonight, I made a choice that gave his back to yours. The debt is settled. Do not call this number again." The line went completely dead. Victoria stood frozen in the center of the cheering room, the microphone slipping from her numb fingers and crashing onto the floor. The relief in her chest was suddenly replaced by a profound, hollow ache, a realization that all the billions her family possessed could not buy a single second of the peace, strength, and safety that walked in the shoes of the man she had just humiliated. Before she could even take a breath, David Kincaid turned around from his monitor, his face suddenly turning a completely different shade of pale. "Miss Sterling," he whispered, the celebration in the room instantly dying out at the tone of his voice. "The aircraft is climbing, yes. But look at the secondary thermal telemetry." When the automated computer forced that dive, the aerodynamic stress exceeded the maximum structural yield of the landing gear bay. The left main gear door has sheared off, and it has severed the primary hydraulic lines to the braking system. Kincaid looked up at her, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "They can fly the plane, Miss Sterling, but they have no brakes, and they have no steering on the ground. When they touch down at Blackburn Airfield in 20 minutes, they are going to strike the tarmac at 200 miles an hour with zero ability to stop." The operations room at Blackburn Airfield degenerated into a secondary panic that felt far more suffocating than the first. On the main tracking grid, the crimson dot representing Vanguard Flight 1 was no longer dropping like a stone, but it was racing toward the airfield at a terrifying speed. David Kincaid stood over his console, his hands flying across the keyboard as emergency data feeds began to pop up in bright yellow windows. "The emergency accumulators are dead, Miss Sterling," Kincaid said, his voice cracking under the immense strain. When the landing gear door ripped away, it took the main hydraulic line and the backup fluid reservoir with it. The pilots have zero pressure. That means no aerodynamic braking flaps on the wings, no wheel brakes on the tarmac, and absolutely no nose wheel steering. They are flying a 60-ton metal block at 200 miles an hour, and when they hit the runway, they They will just keep rolling until they hit something solid enough to stop them. Victoria Sterling backed away from the console, her hands pressing against her ears to block out the sudden wail of the airfield's exterior emergency sirens. Outside the massive glass windows, a fleet of yellow airport fire engines and foam trucks were already tearing across the rain-slicked taxiways, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting violently off the wet asphalt. "What is past the end of runway 9? Victoria asked, her voice dropping to a hollow, breathless whisper. She knew the layout of her own airfield, but her mind was spinning too fast to anchor the memory. Kincaid looked down at his screen, his face turning completely grim. The regional high-voltage transformer station, Miss Sterling. And directly behind it is the primary fuel farm for the entire northern logistics sector. If that aircraft overruns the tarmac, it will plow straight into 3 million gallons of aviation kerosene. Victoria didn't wait for him to finish. She turned on her heel and bolted out of the operations room, her high heels clicking frantically against the concrete floor of the corridor. Her drivers and security detail scrambled to follow her, but she ignored them completely, running straight through the private terminal lobby where the wealthy investors still sat in stunned silence. She pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and threw herself into the driver's seat of her luxury black sedan, slamming her foot onto the accelerator before her security team could even open their own car doors. The drive to Cedar Street was a blur of blinding rain and flashing streetlights. Victoria gripped the leather steering wheel so hard, her manicured nails dug into the palms of her hands. Tears streamed freely down her face, ruining her makeup and blurring her vision. She had spent her entire adult life believing that power, wealth, and a ruthless corporate strategy could resolve any crisis. But as the windshield wipers slapped violently against the glass, she realized the terrifying truth. All her billions could not buy a single pound of hydraulic pressure. They could not extend the runway by a single foot. She was completely, utterly helpless. She pulled up to the curb outside Garrett Vance's modest house, the tires screeching against the asphalt. She didn't grab an umbrella. She didn't care about her expensive charcoal suit. She threw the door open and sprinted up the narrow concrete walkway, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She hammered her fists against the wooden front door, her body shaking violently from the cold rain and the sheer terror consuming her chest. "Please!" Victoria screamed into the wind, pounding the door again. "Garrett, please open the door." The door swung open smoothly, revealing Garrett's massive, grounded frame. He had changed out of his stained coveralls into a clean, faded, gray t-shirt and dark trousers. He stood perfectly still in the threshold, a pillar of absolute calm against the howling storm behind her. He didn't look angry to see her. He didn't look triumphant. His deep green eyes were entirely steady, absorbing her frantic state without a single flicker of surprise. "The hydraulic lines are gone," Victoria sobbed, her hands reaching out to grab the fabric of his sleeve, her fingers trembling against his arm. "The plane is coming in, Garrett. It has no brakes. It has no steering. My father is going to crash into the fuel farm. I don't know what to do. Nobody knows what to do. Please, you have to help me. I'll give you the company. I'll step down. Just save him." Garrett did not move. He looked down at her hands gripping his arm, then looked past her into the darkness of the street. "Come inside, miss." "Sterling," Garrett said quietly, his low voice carrying a density that immediately forced her racing heart to slow down just a fraction. "You're getting the floor wet." He stepped aside, allowing her to stumble into the small, warm living room. The scent of lavender and pine instantly enveloped her, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-pressure chaos of the airfield command center. Lily was sitting on the sofa, holding her perfectly repaired plastic toy airplane. She looked up at Victoria, her wide, innocent eyes filled with a deep, instinctive empathy as she saw the powerful woman completely broken, soaked to the skin, and weeping on their floor. Lily slowly slid off the couch, walking over with small, hesitant steps. She reached out and gently tapped Victoria's wet knee with her tiny hand. "Don't cry, lady," Lily whispered, her voice incredibly soft and sweet. "My daddy is here. He fixes everything that gets broken. He fixed my airplane. See? He can fix your daddy too." Victoria looked down at the little girl, a fresh wave of tears hitting her eyes. The emotional contrast struck her like a physical blow. Hours ago, she had publicly humiliated this man, mocking his income and pointing at his daughter's worn-out shoes to wound his pride. Yet here was that same child, offering her nothing but pure, unvarnished comfort in a room that felt safer than any fortress her wealth had ever built. Garrett walked over, gently lifting Lily into his arms and setting her back onto the sofa with a reassuring pat on her head. "Sit tight, sweetheart. Let Daddy talk to the lady for a minute." He turned back to Victoria, his expression returning to that cool, analytical stillness that defined his quiet masculinity. He didn't offer her a towel, and he didn't waste time on comforting words. He needed facts. "The Sovereign X has an emergency mechanical landing gear extension system," Garrett stated, his voice flat and precise. "Did Fletcher use the manual release pull?" "Yes," Victoria choked out, wiping her face with the back of her wet sleeve. "The gear is down and locked." But Kincaid said the hydraulic pressure is 0. There's no steering. There's no braking. Garrett crossed his massive arms, his eyes narrowing slightly as he calculated the mathematics of the disaster in his head. "The main gear tires are inflated to 200 pounds per square inch," he said smoothly. "If they hit the tarmac at 200 miles an hour with no friction drag, the reverse thrusters on the engines won't be enough to stop the momentum before the end of the asphalt. They will overshoot by at least 1,200 feet. Is there any way to stop it?" Victoria begged, her voice trembling as she stared at him like he was a god holding the threads of her fate. "Any secret override? Any manual valve?" "There are no valves left to open, Miss Sterling," Garrett replied, his voice completely devoid of false hope. "But there is a design feature in the runway itself that your construction team tried to cut from the budget last year to increase your quarterly profit margins. I personally signed the safety directive that forced them to keep it." Victoria blinked, her mind racing. "What design feature?" "The engineered materials arresting system at the southern threshold," Garrett said. "It's a bed of lightweight, crushable concrete blocks placed at the very end of the tarmac. When the heavy tires of an aircraft hit those blocks, they crush instantly under the weight, dragging the landing gear down and destroying the plane's forward momentum safely without causing an explosion." Victoria's face drained of what little color she had left. "Garrett, we bypassed that installation phase on runway 9 3 months ago to speed up the runway expansion project. The bed isn't completed. It's just an empty gravel pit filled with construction equipment and iron girders. If they roll into that, the nose gear will collapse and the fuel tanks in the wings will rupture immediately." The silence that followed her admission was absolute. The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless countdown to an unavoidable tragedy. Victoria lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as she realized that her own corporate greed, her own pursuit of efficiency over safety, had just built the precise trap that was about to take her father's life. Garrett did not scold her. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply walked over to his small desk, picked up his truck keys, and looked back at her with a gaze that had completely transitioned into the cold, sharp focus of a military commander entering a combat zone. "Get in your car and drive back to the airfield," Garrett commanded, his voice vibrating with a sudden, intense authority that brooked zero argument. "Tell Kincaid to clear every single vehicle off taxiway Charlie. Tell Fletcher to deliberately aim the aircraft away from the primary runway and land it on the unpaved grass median running parallel to the cargo hangars." "The grass?" Victoria gasped, her eyes widening. "At 200 miles an hour, the plane will flip over." "It won't flip if he keeps the nose up and lets the mud drag the belly of the fuselage," Garrett said, already walking toward the front door. "The rain has turned that median into a swamp. It's the only natural braking material left on that airfield. I'm going to get my tools. If that airframe breaks apart when it hits the dirt, you are going to need the only man who knows exactly where the manual cabin release latches are located from the outside. Move, Miss Sterling. We have exactly 12 minutes before your father touches the ground." The rusted engine of Garrett Vance's 20-year-old pickup truck roared against the sheet of blinding rain as it tore through the perimeter gates of Blackburn Airfield. Victoria's luxury sedan trailed closely behind, its headlights cutting jagged beams through the dark, torrential downpour. Inside the cab of the truck, Lily sat perfectly upright in her safety seat, her tiny fingers laced through her father's spare jacket. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. Her small face was entirely serene, anchored completely by the sight of her father's massive, steady hands gripping the steering wheel. Garrett pulled up directly to the secure tarmac entrance beneath the primary control tower. He killed the engine, turned to Lily, and unbuckled her with one swift, fluid motion. He scooped her into his arms, shielding her beneath his heavy canvas coat as he stepped out into the storm. Victoria met him at the glass doors, her expensive clothes completely ruined, her face pale and hollow. They entered the central command bunker together. The room was paralyzed. The flashing yellow alerts had turned into a steady, ominous crimson glow. Technicians were shouting over one another, and David Kincaid was hyperventilating into a paper cup. Garrett didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight into the center of the room, set Lily down gently in a plush leather executive chair in the corner, and pointed a finger at Kincaid. "Get off the primary console," Garrett ordered. His voice didn't carry rage, but it possessed a weight so immense that Kincaid instantly scrambled out of the seat without asking a single question. The surrounding staff stared out in absolute silence as the man in the faded gray t-shirt and work trousers slid into the master engineering seat. He plugged a secondary data cable into his rugged laptop and overrode the terminal's display. Instantly, the chaotic, confusing mess of error codes on the main wall screen vanished, replaced by a clean, three-dimensional wireframe model of the approaching Sovereign X. Victoria collapsed into the chair next to Lily, her knees completely giving out. She was shaking so violently, her teeth chattered. Lily looked at the powerful CEO, then looked down at her small, perfectly repaired plastic toy airplane. With a soft, hesitant movement, Lily reached out and placed the toy directly into Victoria's trembling palm. "You can hold it," Lily whispered, her green eyes shining with pure innocence. "My daddy fixed the wing so it won't ever fall out of the sky again. It keeps the monsters away when the loud noises start." Victoria looked at the plastic toy, then at the little girl who had every right to hate her after the cruelty she had displayed in the lounge. The realization tore through Victoria's chest like a physical blade. She had spent her entire life surrounded by board members, lawyers, and billionaires who promised her security through contracts and capital. Yet, in the most terrifying moment of her life, true emotional safety was being handed to her by a 5-year-old child in a faded shirt, sitting in a room built by a man who didn't need a single dime of her fortune to be powerful. She clutched the toy to her chest, sobbing silently. Garrett threw on a heavy tactical headset, his fingers moving across the manual overrides. Chief Thomas Callahan from the Airfield Fire Rescue Base crackled through the comms. "Vance? Is that you? We've got 12 foam units deployed along runway 9, but if Fletcher shifts to the grass median, my trucks will bog down in the mud instantly. We won't be able to reach the wreckage if it catches fire." "Then keep your distance until the kinetic energy dissipates, Callahan," Garrett countered, his voice an unyielding anchor of clinical logic. "If they land on the asphalt with 0 brakes, they are guaranteed to ignite 3 million gallons of kerosene at the fuel farm. The mud is our only buffer. Position your units at the intersection of Taxiway Charlie and prepare for a manual foam suppression run the second the airframe stops sliding." He flipped the toggle to the primary cockpit frequency. "Harrison, do you have eyes on the ground?" "Garrett!" Captain Fletcher's voice exploded through the speakers, gasping for breath over the deafening scream of the wind tearing at the severed gear doors. "We just broke through the lower cloud deck at 1,200 feet. The rain is blinding. I can barely see the approach lights. The left wing is bucking violently. The hydraulic asymmetry is dragging us offline. I can't keep her straight." "Listen to me very carefully, Harrison," Garrett said, his eyes locked onto the rapidly moving wireframe on his screen. "Stop fighting the lateral drift with the rudder. You don't have the pressure to maintain a standard slip. Let the wind carry the nose 3 degrees to the left. You're going to aim for the wide grass strip running parallel to the cargo hangars." "The grass?" Fletcher screamed. "Commander, if the nose gear digs into the dirt at this speed, the cockpit will plow straight under the airframe. We'll be crushed alive. You are going to hold the nose wheel off the ground until the speed drops below 80 knots, Garrett instructed, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic level of complete certainty that forced the panicked pilot to stop screaming. "You will touch down on the main rear gear only. Keep the control column buried in your chest. Let the mud swallow the rear tires. It's going to feel like an explosion, Harrison. The structural skin of the belly is going to rip away, but the keel beam will hold. Trust the airframe. I designed it to survive this exact impact." On the massive radar wall, the altitude readouts flashed through the final hundreds. 400 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet. Through the towering glass windows of the control tower, Victoria, Lily, and the entire operations team leaned forward, their breaths catching completely in their throats. Through the driving sheets of gray rain, the massive, twin-engine silhouette of the Sovereign X suddenly emerged from the darkness. Its landing lights threw brilliant, desperate cones of white illumination into the storm. The plane was coming in sideways, its left wing tilting dangerously toward the earth. Garrett stood up from his console, his eyes locked onto the real aircraft as it roared over the perimeter fence. "Hold the nose up, Harrison," Garrett whispered into the microphone, his body rigid, his quiet masculinity radiating an intense, almost spiritual pressure throughout the silent bunker. "Hold it! Hold it!" The aircraft slammed into the unpaved grass median at 200 miles an hour. The impact was catastrophic to watch. A massive, towering wall of black mud, torn sod, and white water erupted into the night sky, completely swallowing the vessel. The immense weight of the 60-ton aircraft dragged deep into the saturated earth, the rear landing gear snapping away instantly with a deafening, metallic shriek that echoed even through the thick glass of the tower windows. The airframe began to twist violently to the right, the structural steel groaning in agony as the belly plowed a deep, brutal trench through the swampy ground. Sparks flew in a blinding, brilliant cascade from the exposed underbelly, illuminating the entire airfield in a ghostly white glare. Suddenly, the plane hit a hidden concrete drainage culvert buried beneath the grass. The entire tail section of the Sovereign X violently buckled upward, cracking open like an eggshell. The main fuselage lifted 2 feet into the air, spun completely around, and slammed back into the mud sideways, rolling over onto its left side before skidding to a dead stop in a massive, smoking heap of twisted metal and shattered composite panels. The cockpit windows were completely buried in the dark mud. The emergency lights on the wings flickered twice, then died out completely, plunging the wreckage into total darkness. In the command tower, the primary radio channel violently snapped into a horrific, piercing blast of static, followed by absolute, terrifying silence. The digital wireframe on Garrett's screen froze, then vanished into a blank screen. Victoria let out a strangled, breathless scream, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the dark, motionless wreckage of her father's plane. Garrett threw his headset onto the console. He didn't look at the radar. He didn't wait for the fire trucks. He turned toward the corner of the room, grabbed his heavy metal tool case with one hand, and looked at Victoria with an expression that made her heart stop entirely. "The main cabin door is jammed shut under the left wing flare," Garrett said, his voice deadly quiet. The automatic fire suppression system inside the electronics bay just shorted out. They have exactly 4 minutes before the residual heat ignites the auxiliary fuel tank in the tail. Stay here with Lily. He turned and sprinted toward the emergency elevator, leaving Victoria standing alone in the deafening silence of the room, clutching a plastic toy airplane as her father's life ticked away in the mud. The high-definition tracking cameras on the main wall of the Blackburn Airfield command tower swiveled automatically, locking their powerful lenses onto the steaming wreckage in the mud median. On the giant screens, the imagery was terrifyingly clear. Wisps of acrid white smoke were beginning to curl out from the fractured tail section of the Sovereign X, hissing violently as the torrential rain struck the overheating auxiliary power unit. The airport rescue trucks were trapped. Their massive, heavy chassis had sunk deep into the saturated, swampy earth 50 yards away from the fuselage, their wheels spinning uselessly, throwing up great plumes of wet mud. The firefighters were on foot, struggling to drag heavy equipment hoses through the knee-deep mire, losing precious seconds. Then, the perimeter camera caught a lone vehicle entering the frame. Garrett Vance's faded pickup truck did not stop at the edge of the asphalt. He slammed the vehicle into four-wheel drive, the old engine screaming as he plowed directly into the mud, using the momentum to bridge the gap before the truck finally bogged down 20 feet from the burning aircraft. Inside the command tower, the crowd of corporate executives, investors, and logistics directors pressed against the glass windows, their eyes wide, their breath fogging the pain. Nobody spoke. The arrogance that had filled the room earlier had evaporated into absolute awe. They were watching a man they had dismissed as a second-rate laborer charge directly into a ticking bomb. Victoria Sterling stood right at the center of the glass, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely keep her grip on the small plastic toy airplane Lily had given her. Beside her, sitting quietly in the large leather chair, Lily watched the screen. The little girl's face remained perfectly peaceful, her absolute faith in her father operating like an invisible shield against the panic filling the room. "Look at him," David Kincaid whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. "He isn't even hesitating." On the monitors, Garrett exploded out of the truck's cab. He didn't run with the panic desperation of the emergency crews. His movements were heavy, rhythmic, and perfectly calculated. He carried his old metal tool case in his right hand as if it weighed nothing at all. He reached the crumpled nose of the aircraft, where the emergency response team was frantically battering against the primary passenger hatch with a hydraulic spreader. "Stop!" Garrett's voice cut through the tactical radio channel, echoing inside the command tower. "If you apply hydraulic pressure to that frame, The compressed fuselage will buckle further and rupture the oxygen lines directly beneath the cockpit floor. Drop the tools! The rescue captain turned furious until he saw Garrett's face through the driving rain. The absolute command radiating from the former military pilot stopped the captain in his tracks. "Commander Vance?" The captain gasped over the radio. "The door is jammed solid. The locking pins are warped from the impact. We can't clear the path." "Get back," Garrett commanded. He didn't waste time trying to force the primary door. He sprinted around to the underside of the nose gear bay, a section completely packed with thick, black swamp mud. Without a second thought, Garrett dropped to his knees in the mire, shoving his bare arms deep into the freezing sludge, searching for a specific structural rib by feel alone. In the tower, an executive shook his head. What is he doing? He's digging in the dirt. The plane is going to blow in less than 2 minutes. He isn't digging, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, breathless whisper as she stared at the screen. She was beginning to understand. He knows the skeleton of that machine. He built it. Deep within the mud-filled wheel well, Garrett's fingers found the heavy steel ring of the auxiliary mechanical release cable, a classified military-grade redundancy he had personally forced the engineers to install during the prototype phase 10 years ago. An item completely omitted from the standard commercial manuals to save $300 in production weight. Garrett wrapped his calloused hand around the cold steel ring, planted his heavy boots against the collapsed structural frame, and pulled with every ounce of his massive strength. The muscles in his back coiled and strained against the metal, his jaw locking in silent, intense exertion. With a massive, echoing clang that tore through the storm, the internal locking pins sheared in half. The main cabin door violently popped outward, clearing the mud and swinging open a foot. The firefighters let out a collective gasp, instantly rushing forward. But Garrett was already ahead of them. He hoisted himself into the dark, smoke-filled cabin without a single trace of fear. The interior of the Sovereign X was a nightmare of twisted plastic and burning insulation. Captain Fletcher was slumped over the controls, unconscious but breathing, a deep gash bleeding freely across his forehead. In the main cabin, pinned beneath a heavy oak partition that had torn free from the executive galley, was Lawrence Sterling. The billionaire was conscious, coughing violently as the thick gray smoke filled his lungs. Lawrence looked up through the haze, his vision blurring, and saw the silhouette of the man he had wronged a decade ago standing over him like an immovable specter. Garrett. Lawrence wheezed, his voice weak, his hands clutching his pinned legs. You came. Garrett didn't say a word. He didn't look at Lawrence with pity, nor did he look at him with anger. He knelt down, his massive shoulders wedging beneath the heavy oak partition. With a single explosive lift, he shattered the remaining plastic mounts, hurling the 100-pound barrier entirely off the old man's legs. He scooped Lawrence up effortlessly, throwing the billionaire over his broad shoulder like a piece of cargo, before reaching into the cockpit and grabbing Captain Fletcher by his safety harness, dragging the unconscious pilot along the floor with his free hand. 30 seconds later, the perimeter camera showed Garrett emerging from the smoking ruin of the aircraft, carrying the wealthiest man in the aerospace industry on his back, while pulling the chief pilot through the mud. The moment his boots touched the edge of the asphalt runway, the auxiliary fuel tank in the tail section of the Sovereign X finally detonated. A massive, brilliant fireball erupted into the night sky, throwing a towering column of orange flame through the rain, illuminating the entire airfield. The concussive wave shattered the remaining windows of the aircraft, but Garrett didn't even look back. He kept walking, steady and unbroken, carrying the survival of Vanguard Aerospace in his hands. Inside the command tower, the silence was total. The investors, the directors, the technicians, everyone stood frozen, staring at the screen as the true power dynamic of the Sterling Empire was permanently turned upside down. The wealth in the room meant nothing, the corporate titles meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the quiet, masculine strength of the man walking through the fire. Victoria lowered her head against the glass, her shoulders shaking as a sob escaped her throat. She looked down at the toy airplane in her hand, then turned toward Lily. The little girl gave her a small, knowing smile. "See?" Lily whispered softly, her eyes shining in the orange glow of the screen. "I told you, my daddy always wins." The glass elevator of the central control tower descended in a heavy, echoing silence. Victoria Sterling didn't look at her reflection in the polished glass, nor did she look at David Kincaid or the cluster of executive board members who scrambled inside behind her. Her world had narrowed to a single point, the rain-slicked, fire-illuminated tarmac of Blackburn Airfield. In her right hand, her fingers remained tightly locked around Lily's small, broken plastic toy airplane, the edges of the plastic biting into her palm, a grounding shock of reality against the numbness spreading through her veins. Beside her, holding her hand with a gentle but entirely fearless grip, was Lily. The 5-year-old child walked with a calm, rhythmic grace that completely put the panicked billionaires in the elevator to shame. When the doors slid open to the ground floor staging area, the noise hit them like a physical wall. Sirens wailed across the open perimeter. High-intensity floodlights from the emergency vehicles sliced through the driving gray sheets of rain, painting the concrete in rotating shades of blinding white, crimson, and amber. Dozens of mechanics, security officers, and high-profile terminal guests had spilled out onto the edge of the hangar apron, completely ignoring the storm, their faces turned toward the mud median where the fire was finally being suppressed by a heavy blanket of white chemical foam. Victoria sprinted across the wet concrete, her ruined heels clicking frantically before she finally tore them off, running barefoot into the freezing rain. She didn't care about her appearance. She didn't care about the cameras or the whispers of the crowd. Near the open bay doors of Hangar 3, 3 emergency medical units had formed a perimeter. Paramedics in bright yellow jackets were lifting a gurney into the back of the primary ambulance. On it sat Lawrence Sterling, an oxygen mask pressed over his face, his silver-headed walking cane shattered into 2 pieces beside his legs. "Father!" Victoria cried out, her voice breaking as she reached the side of the gurney. She threw her arms around his fragile shoulders, weeping openly. Lawrence pulled the oxygen mask away with a trembling hand, his eyes wet with a profound, unvarnished emotion his daughter had never seen in his entire life. He didn't look like the ruthless corporate king who had built a global aviation empire. He looked like an old man who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back by a miracle. "Victoria," Lawrence whispered, his breath shallow and wheezing. The keel beam held, just like he said it would. "He didn't leave me, Victoria. He carried me out on his back. After everything I did to him, he didn't leave me." Victoria squeezed his hand, her chest heaving as she looked past the medical team. "Where is he? Where is Garrett?" A dozen yards away, sitting calmly on the heavy iron bumper of a secondary fire rescue truck, was Garrett Vance. He had refused to lie down on a gurney. He had refused the oxygen mask. A thick, dark wool blanket had been draped over his broad shoulders by a paramedic, but it sat there loosely, completely secondary to the sheer, dense mass of the man beneath it. His gray t-shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked with a mixture of freezing rain and black aviation grease. His knuckles were raw and bleeding slightly where he had sheared the locking pins of the aircraft door, but his face remained a monument of absolute, unbreakable stillness. Lily let go of Victoria's hand and ran. "Daddy!" she squealed, her tiny boots splashing through the puddles. Garrett's entire expression transformed in a single fraction of a second. The cool, analytical distance of the military commander melted away, replaced by a radiant, infinitely warm fatherhood. He dropped to one knee on the wet asphalt, his massive arms opening wide as Lily launched her small body directly into his chest. He caught her effortlessly, lifting her tucked legs against his ribs, burying his face into her soft hair. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Garrett murmured, his deep voice a low, soothing vibration that completely drowned out the roaring sirens around them. "I've got you. You're safe. Did you eat your pasta?" Lily nodded against his neck, her tiny arms wrapping tightly around his collarbone. "I ate it, Daddy, and I gave the lady my airplane." It kept her safe, too. Victoria walked toward them, her steps slowing into a hesitant, almost reverent pace. The crowd of elite investors, local politicians, and Vanguard board members who had followed her down from the tower formed a wide, silent circle around the rescue truck. 6 hours ago, these same executives had laughed while Victoria threatened this man with handcuffs. Now, they stood with their heads bowed, their expensive suits soaked by the rain, completely paralyzed by the sheer psychological weight of Garrett's presence. They were looking at a man who didn't need a single ounce of their titles, their money, or their approval to command the absolute reality of the airfield. Victoria stopped 3 feet away from him. She looked down at her own trembling hands, then raised her eyes to meet his steady green gaze. The emotional contrast between them was devastating. She was Victoria Sterling, a woman who possessed everything the modern world defined as power, billions, and assets, global influence, and a ruthless reputation. Yet, as she stood there shivering, her chest hollowed out by fear, she realized she had absolutely no peace. And then there was Garrett, a man who earned a line mechanic's wage, who lived in a 740 square foot house, but who radiated an emotional security so massive that the entire airfield seemed to anchor itself directly to his bones. He gave safety without even trying. "Garrett," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking, completely stripped of her corporate armor. She lowered her head, a deep, genuine shame darkening her face. "I am so sorry. For what I said to you in the lounge. For what my family did to you 10 years ago, I thought I could run this world with numbers and schedules. I didn't know anything. I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness. But thank you for saving my father." Garrett stood up slowly, keeping Lily safely nestled against his shoulder with one hand. He looked at Victoria for a long, silent moment. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the unspoken ghosts of a decade-old tragedy and the sudden, raw truth of the present. He didn't offer a polite deflection. He didn't give her a comforting lie. "Your father survived because the engineering specifications were respected, miss." "Sterling," Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying an effortless, grounded authority that made the surrounding crowd lean in just to catch the weight of it. "Not because of a corporate strategy. If you want to run an aerospace company, you need to remember that the data points on your spreadsheets are real human lives. If you forget that again, the next airframe won't be there to catch you." Victoria looked up, her emerald eyes swimming with fresh tears as she met his gaze. She didn't flinch from his words. She absorbed them completely, recognizing the rare, genuine humanity behind his quiet masculinity. "I won't forget," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly as her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a sudden, unspoken warmth through the freezing air. "I promise you, Garrett. I won't forget." Lily reached out from Garrett's shoulder, her small green eyes darting between her father and the vulnerable woman standing before them. She noticed the subtle, lingering eye contact, the silent pause that seemed to stretch out between them like a fragile bridge. Lily smiled softly, reaching into Victoria's hand and gently retrieving her plastic toy airplane. "See, lady?" Lily whispered with a tiny, triumphant nod. "My daddy always fixes what's broken. Even the big things." Garrett looked down at his daughter, a faint, incredibly rare smile brushing the corner of his lips before he looked back at Victoria, his expression softening just enough to let her see the man beneath the armor. He shifted Lily's weight on his shoulder, turned his back on the silent, admiring crowd, and began walking back toward his old truck, leaving Victoria standing in the rain with a heart that had finally found something real to believe in. 3 days after the catastrophic storm at Blackburn Airfield, the morning sun finally broke through the gray canopy of clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the glass facade of Vanguard Tower in the heart of the city's financial district. Inside the grand executive boardroom on the 50th floor, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. A high-stakes emergency meeting of the primary board of directors had been called, and the massive mahogany table was surrounded by the company's most powerful institutional investors. At the head of the table stood Charles Abernathy, a ruthless, silver-haired senior board member who represented the aggressive hedge funds that owned a massive portion of Vanguard stock. He slammed a thick stack of financial printouts onto the table, his eyes narrowing as he glared across the room at Victoria Sterling. "This company has just suffered a $60 million hull loss on a live runway," Abernathy shouted, his voice echoing sharply against the soundproof glass walls. "The press is asking questions about structural defects. Our stock price has dipped 4% since Tuesday morning, and you, Victoria, spent the entire night of the incident operating on the frantic theories of an uncertified line mechanic. You bypassed standard corporate protocol. You put the entire reputation of this empire at risk because of an emotional panic." Victoria sat perfectly upright in her leather chair. She had not slept in 72 hours, but the hollow, fractured look she had worn on the rain-slicked tarmac was gone. In its place was a quiet, cold, and utterly unbreakable resolve. She wore a simple, flawless, cream-colored blazer, her hands folded neatly on the table before her. Right beside her notepad, sitting in plain view of every billionaire in the room, was a small, plastic toy airplane with a neatly glued tail wing. "I did not operate on panic, Mr. Abernathy," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, entirely level register that instantly cut through his shouting. "I operated on structural facts." The line mechanic you are referring to predicted the exact altitude, the exact airspeed, and the exact mechanical failure of that aircraft 20 minutes before it occurred. If I had not listened to him, my father and two of our finest pilots would be at the bottom of Lake Michigan right now. Abernathy let out a cold, dismissive sneer, looking around the table at the other board members to gather their silent agreement. That is a sentimental argument, Victoria. In the real world, a corporation runs on compliance, liability management, and investor confidence. The fact remains that you terminated that worker publicly, then reinstated him without board approval, and allowed an outsider access to our restricted satellite data link. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. I have already gathered the necessary proxy votes from the primary block. We are initiating a formal vote to strip you of your executive titles for gross negligence, effective immediately. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't look at the board members who were avoiding her gaze. She simply looked at the heavy oak double doors at the back of the boardroom. The vote is out of order. A deep, raspy voice boomed from the threshold. The doors swung open smoothly, and Lawrence Sterling walked into the room. He was leaning heavily on a simple, dark mahogany cane, his chest wrapped in medical braces beneath his tailored suit, but his presence was entirely commanding. The older billionaire looked at Abernathy with a gaze that had ruthlessly built the industry from nothing. But it was the man walking directly beside Lawrence that caused every director in the room to freeze in absolute, paralyzed shock. Garrett Vance walked into the executive boardroom. He was no longer wearing his oil-stained navy coveralls or his faded gray t-shirt. He wore a perfectly fitted, dark charcoal wool suit that emphasized the massive, dense breadth of his shoulders and his quiet, imposing masculinity. His hair was neatly combed, his rugged face clean-shaven, save for the faint silver scars along his jawline. He looked entirely at home in the room, his deep green eyes scanning the table with the cool, calculating precision of a commander surveying a tactical grid. Holding his left hand, walking with a proud, happy bounce in her step, was Lily. She wore a beautiful white sundress and a brand new pair of bright green shoes with completely flawless soles. She looked around the massive boardroom with wide, curious eyes, entirely unbothered by the wealth and intimidation filling the space. "What is the meaning of this?" Abernathy stammered, his face flushing red as he stood up from his chair. "Lawrence, you are recovering from a severe accident. And why have you brought this terminated employee and a child into a secure corporate session?" "Security." The security guards stationed at the door did not move a single inch. They stood at absolute attention, their eyes locked forward, completely ignoring Abernathy's commands. "Sit down, Charles," Lawrence Sterling said, his voice entirely steady as he took his seat at the far end of the table. "You don't own the block you think you do, and you certainly don't own the air we fly in." Garrett stepped forward, his heavy leather shoes striking the floor with a slow, rhythmic weight that forced the entire room into a breathless silence. He didn't look at the financial documents or the digital charts. He looked directly at Abernathy. 10 years ago, Garrett said, his low, resonant rumble filling the vast space with an effortless power that made the high-end sound system unnecessary. "When Vanguard Aerospace forced my retirement from the experimental flight division, your legal team presented a standard corporate non-disclosure agreement paired with a multi-million-dollar severance package. I refused the money." The board members shifted uncomfortably, a few of the older directors leaning forward as a sudden, terrifying memory began to surface. "I didn't take your capital," Garrett continued, his expression perfectly flat, a monument of absolute, unyielding calm. "Because capital can be manipulated by a board vote. Instead, my legal representation structured a specific, non-negotiable clause into the settlement. In exchange for the digital fly-by-wire stabilization code that keeps your entire fleet from tearing its wings off at high speeds, the intellectual property rights were transferred into a private, independent blind trust called Apex Aerodynamics." Garrett set a single leather-bound document onto the center of the table. "I am the sole trustee and absolute owner of Apex Aerodynamics," Garrett said quietly, his green eyes locking onto Abernathy with a piercing, devastating intensity. "Every aircraft Vanguard Aerospace manufactures, sells, or operates relies on a live software license that I personally control. Under Section 12 of the original compliance charter, if this company intentionally falsifies a maintenance log or attempts to conceal a known safety defect to protect its stock price, I have the unilateral, supreme authority to revoke that license immediately." Abernathy's jaw dropped completely open. his face turning an unvarnished, ghostly shade of white as the reality of his position collapsed around him. You wouldn't," he breathed, his hands trembling against the mahogany table. "If you revoke the license, our entire global fleet is grounded within the hour. The company will go bankrupt by Friday. Then I suggest you start packing your desk, Mr. Abernathy," Victoria Sterling said. She stood up slowly, her emerald eyes shining with a brilliant, triumphant warmth as she looked at Garrett, then down at the stunned board members. "Because as the chief executive officer of this company, my first official act this morning is to accept the formal recommendation of our new Supreme Chief Technical Director, Mr. Vance has just initiated a full, transparent audit of our entire safety division. Anyone who has ever signed off on a substandard material replacement to save $1 on production will be removed from this organization by the end of the day." She turned her gaze back to Abernathy, her voice hitting with the absolute weight of a mallet. "Security, please escort Mr. Abernathy out of the building. His corporate credentials have just been permanently deactivated." The two security guards stepped forward instantly, grabbing the sputtering, humiliated director by his arms and dragging him out of the boardroom in plain view of the remaining executives. The door clicked shut behind them, and a sudden spontaneous wave of applause erupted from the remaining board members, their previous hesitation completely transforming into absolute, roaring admiration for the man who had just saved their lives and their integrity. Garrett did not acknowledge the applause. He gave Lawrence a single respectful nod, then looked across the length of the long table at Victoria. The silence that fell between them was no longer filled with the heavy weight of a tragic past. It was a breathable, living space filled with a deep, mutual respect and a quiet, growing warmth that didn't need a single word to be understood. An hour later, after the boardroom had emptied, the high-intensity corporate pressure of Vanguard Tower seemed to fade into a peaceful serenity. Victoria walked out onto the private, landscaped observation balcony that overlooked the sprawling skyline of the city. The wind was soft, carrying the faint, clean scent of the morning rain. Lily was already out there, kneeling by a wide stone planter, happily flying her plastic toy airplane through the air, her tiny voice making soft engine noises as she guided the toy over the green leaves. Garrett stood at the edge of the glass railing, his hands in his pockets, his broad shoulders catching the golden rays of the morning sun. He looked entirely grounded, an immovable anchor of safety in a world that spent all its time racing toward the next deadline. Victoria walked up beside him, her bare shoulder brushing gently against his sleeve. She didn't look at the city below. She looked at his rugged profile, a rare, genuine smile softening her elegant face. "I checked the manufacturing schedule for Runway 9 this morning," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying a deep, emotional vulnerability she had never shared with anyone before. "The engineered materials arresting bed is being poured today. We are stopping all flights until the safety buffers are completed." Garrett turned his head slowly, his green eyes meeting hers with a warmth that sent a sudden, comfortable thrill through her chest. "I know," he said quietly. "I saw the maintenance routing before I came up." "You did well, Victoria." Victoria looked down at her hands, her fingers moving slightly against the fabric of her blazer before she took a slow, brave breath. She reached out, her fingers trembling just a fraction, and gently slid her hand into his massive, calloused palm. "I spent my whole life thinking that power was something you build with buildings and contracts," Victoria whispered, her eyes locking onto his with absolute, unvarnished honesty. "But these past 3 days, watching you, I realized that true power is just having a place where the floor doesn't move. You gave that to my father. You gave it to this company. And I think you gave it to me too." Garrett did not pull his hand away, his large, warm fingers folded smoothly around hers, his grip tight, deliberate, and entirely protective. He didn't make a grand promise, and he didn't deliver a rehearsed speech. He simply held her hand there in the open sunlight, his quiet masculinity offering an unbreakable sanctuary that all the billions in the world could never buy. From across the balcony, Lily paused her game. She looked over and saw her father's large hand completely enveloping Victoria's, their silhouettes standing perfectly together against the bright blue sky. A massive, brilliant smile broke across the little girl's face, her green eyes shining with a pure childhood joy as she saw the light finally turning on in a world that had been dark for a very long time. She turned back to her toy airplane, launching it into the wind with a bright, beautiful laugh that carried easily over the edge of the city, echoing into a future that was finally being built on a foundation that would never break again.